Howdy. Welcome to the 8:30 Live. So I'm just going to go and get this thing shared on the Facebook page and give time for folks to tune in. But what I will say is I guess folks are going to have to go watch this because nobody's popped in yet. But as mentioned yesterday about the pulse oximeters, this is what a pulse oximeter looks like. It's the thing that they clip onto your finger, and this is what measures your oxygen levels and, tells you whether or not you have coronavirus, because apparently low oxygen levels, with or without other symptoms, may be a strong indicator of having COVID-19. So pulse oximeter right here, it shines an infrared light through your finger and then picks up the oxygen levels. Share to page. Anyway, so that was fun. I'm going to put that over there, push this button, and then we'll just dive right on in because people are starting to show up, which is great. I love to see everybody. Now, what are we talking about today? Well, there were a lot of things that folks want. Now that I ask people what they want to hear about before the show, I now am beginning to spend something like half an hour to 45 minutes just researching things before this all goes down, just to make sure that the information I'm conveying is correct, which is a bit more than I originally started with when I began doing these lives. But whatever, it's fun. I learn a lot, or at least I refresh my memory on a lot. But first, as usual, as people are still showing up, a couple of headlines. Oh, first headline for the newcomer, the early folks, get here early. As promised, there's going to be a Zoom version of this for next week. We're going to give it a shot. So if anybody has any thoughts on how they'd like that formatted, I'm thinking like structured dialogue around topics with people, maybe even guest folks, because I saw Tila jumped in, and Tila apparently knows more than me about pretty much everything. So have other people who know things come on and say stuff. Bring in some folks from politics who have been going through some of the ugly morass we spoke about in Brooklyn, things like that. So let me know what you want. But that being said, let's jump into some of the headlines now. So first, starting off light, you might have heard Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. They are giving back the $20 million they took from the small business assistance program, or the Paycheck Protection Program. So that's great. There was a huge backlash. So apparently corporations do care to some degree whether or not people hate their guts in the middle of a pandemic. Normally they don't care. So it's nice to know that in these special times, special things are happening. So they're giving back their $20 million. I was also asked particularly to speak to the Mitch McConnell comment that states should just go bankrupt. That is to say, the federal government shouldn't bail them out, and that the states are on their own, and that if they can't afford to meet their payment and debt obligations, they should file for bankruptcy. And there's a whole code, bankruptcy code for states. Now, Andrew Cuomo came out and said that's the dumbest thing he's ever heard. But perhaps more interestingly, Representative Steve King, who's a terrible, terrible human being, Republican congressman from Long Island, came out and excoriated Mitch McConnell on that statement as well. Of course, New York, being one of the states hardest hit by coronavirus, is experiencing some of the toughest economic consequences and reduction in revenue and really state budget difficulties. Now, let's just talk about for a second what would happen if states started to go bankrupt. And we mentioned this a bit last night, and some of the things we've spoken about several times. One is the unending downward spiral into depression as state cuts lead to layoffs, which reduces economic activity, which leads to reduced profit for businesses, which leads to reduced taxes, which leads to reduced revenue for the state, which leads to more layoffs, which leads to less economic activity, and so on and so forth. So that is, of course, one consequence. But really what happens when the state goes bankrupt? Well, the state has to get its money from somewhere. So basically the idea is, states have expenses and they owe money to all their employees, et cetera. Some of the stuff you can kind of shed or temporarily put off through furloughing or firing of workers, putting off upkeep of infrastructure. But other things like payments into pension programs or debt payment, these are things that you can't really put off. People keep coming for their money. You can't fire your creditors. They've given you money and you're meant to pay that back. Same thing with pension programs that are stipulated in law, or maybe even in the Constitution, as in some cases, in some states, that in New York State, for example, that the money be put aside from the state budget. So what happens when you run out of money? Well, you file for bankruptcy, and then there's a managed repayment of your debts. And normally this comes in the form of liquidation of assets. You have to liquidate assets to generate free cash. Now, what does this look like for governments? Well, there's two things that governments do. One is they do liquidate assets. So the state, for example, owns land. So these would be protected lands that are set aside for environmental or public benefit. These would be public spaces that have a function, but that the state can no longer afford to maintain or is forced to sell. And then, aside from the liquidation of assets, you have the privatization of services. So the state will sell off a business for cash. For example, it will privatize bridges or roads so that a private entity will buy the rights to that road or to that bridge and then charge a toll, generating revenue and, in their esteem, profit based on the amount that they paid for that private good. Another thing that could be privatized, for example, is transportation. In fact, a lot of folks don't know that the subway and bus system in New York City used to be privately held. The subways were dug by private companies that ran them for profit by charging toll fares. This was ultimately undone when those companies went bankrupt, or really, well, I won't go into the whole story of why the subway system didn't work out in private hands, but it was taken over by the government and actually was done piecemeal. So parts of the subways were taken over by the government. And then the last one, I think, was actually quite late, almost maybe in the 60s or something. It was one of the bus companies. And all of the buses in the city were eventually brought into the fold. But this is why, the subways and the buses actually have different governing organizations. Well, some of the buses are controlled by the MTA, and then there's like another bus system that's not, and this has to do with the legacy of the acquisition of these private companies by the government. New York owns them now. Okay, I know you know everything. I know. But that being said, what Mitch McConnell is basically suggesting is that states divest themselves of all the public assets they hold and then privatize all of their services. Now, I find this really, really interesting because the old moniker of Moscow Mitch is way more apt for this than it was for his, sort of support of a president who might have been, whose election might have been influenced by Russia. This is literally what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. This is exactly what the West forced Russia to do, which was to privatize everything in what was known at the time as economic, quote, shock therapy, to shock the economy from a stagnant, planned or command economy to a capitalist economy. And they just basically were like, yeah, state goes bankrupt, sell off all of your assets, privatize all of your services, and that'll be great. Anyway, it ruined Russia, and it is absolutely hilarious. I mean, in a morose sort of way, because this has been maybe not Russia as a whole, but absolutely Vladimir Putin's dream to inflict upon the United States the same pain and disaster that was experienced by the Soviet Union during its collapse. And this is precisely what Moscow Mitch is prescribing to the various states of the Union. So anyway, I just thought that was a really interesting connection there between Mitch McConnell's current policy goals and this sort of connection he's had to Russia for the last 4 years because he backs Donald Trump. Anyway, for those who are curious, I hope you're satisfied with the answer of what happens when states go bankrupt. Another big thing was there was a question about testing and about contact tracing. And in fact, this dovetails beautifully on a story that came out today saying that 13.9% of New York State is thought to have contracted coronavirus based on random sampling in 40 different municipalities or localities. I don't want to say municipalities because they weren't all cities, obviously. But the state did a testing of 3,000 New Yorkers in 40 different localities. And from that are extrapolating that something like 13% or 14% of New York State has contracted COVID-19 at this point. In New York City, that number is higher, something closer to 21%. So basically an extrapolation that a fifth of New York City has gotten coronavirus. And this is pretty important because it says something about the work we're doing. So when I posted this on Facebook, somebody immediately came on and was like, and nobody's, we're not overwhelmed. People aren't dying left and right. I mean, some people are dying, but it's not this huge disaster where like everybody in New York is dead. Time to reopen, something along those lines. And I just want to remind people, that the fact that we don't have everybody dropping dead is the point of social distancing. There's two main goals to shutting down the state and preventing the spread of coronavirus. The first, which I think is beyond us, is to prevent the transmission so effectively that the disease just burns itself out. It kills its last person. It dies in its last host. It can't be transmitted because there's nowhere to go. We've locked it down and the disease goes extinct. This is basically what happened to SARS. This is not really going to happen. The other thing that we're looking to do is just, again, flatten the curve. And to drive home what that means, it's to prevent the number of people who fall ill from overburdening the hospital system. And as I've mentioned several times in other nightly chats, my brother who works at a hospital has told me that his hospital is completely full. Everything has been converted into ICUs and COVID treatment rooms. There are still elective surgeries and elective treatments and all sorts of other things that are not being done because hospitals are full. That being said, we have done a great job at flattening the curve because hospitals are full, but are not having to. There was a moment where this was reported that it did happen, but at this moment, we're not really having to ration beds. People who get sick get treatment. And that is why we're not seeing a billion trillion deaths. It's not because coronavirus isn't important, and it's not because we could have just had the economy humming and nobody would have gotten sick. It's probably because we did almost exactly the right thing at almost exactly the last moment so that we barely got to a point where the healthcare system wouldn't have been entirely overwhelmed. So the fact that we're at 20% exposure, we know where our limits are. And everything we do from this moment on should be, and really must be, geared towards maintaining the level where it is and no higher, at least until we add a lot of capacity. And I'll just end this by saying a couple of nights ago, we were talking about this and like, what are the possible outcomes of or endings for the coronavirus situation? And the most likely one is just that we ramp up hospital capacity. We accept that people are going to get sick. We bring the death rate down as low as possible. And some people still die. But again, this is entirely dependent on not overwhelming the hospital system because people still get heart attacks, people still get the flu, people still have to go to the hospital for other reasons. And the minute you have no beds available for people, folks who don't have to die start dying, and the death rate, not just for coronavirus, but for all other things, goes way, way up. So coronavirus, incidentally, causes people to die at much higher rates. And that is why you shouldn't look at these numbers and say, oh, a fifth of New York got it, and the whole city hasn't dropped dead. This must be fine. We should get back to work tomorrow. Please consider the fact that all of the work we've been doing to slow the spread and keep the system from being overwhelmed has actually been effective. Now, there have been some comments, and I want to go back and just read them out. Tila, he's the one who purchased everything along with some other dudes. Putin being, yes. This is why Russia has oligarchs, because they privatized all their state assets in like a week, and rich people connected people in the Soviet Union who had some money, basically just scooped up transportation, oil, telecoms, just everything, and they became multi-billionaires because they have all of the assets of an entire nation under their control because it was just so important to privatize. Anyway, if you want an economy like Russia's, follow Mitch McConnell's advice. Tila says, our infection to death ratio is technically one of the best in the world. Well, that makes me feel good. It does. It's nice. But that being said, to get into the specifics of what contact and contact tracing and testing are and how they work, as was requested, I've got a couple of stats and figures for folks that come from doctors and the like. So, first and foremost, there was a blue ribbon panel put together by lots of smart folk that came up with a plan for reopening America. And basically, their conclusion was, to put it simply, the United States needs about 2 to 3 million tests done daily. Then you can do the contact tracing, and then you can do the supported isolation, which enables everybody else to get back on with their lives. So this is a system called TTSI, testing, tracing, and supported isolation. The idea being that right now we're all isolated because we don't know who's sick. And if we did testing and tracing, we only have to isolate the people who we know who have COVID or are exposed to COVID, and everybody else is basically free to go about their day. The folks who unfortunately contracted have to go into isolation, but we support them in isolation so that they don't die, starve, or feel left out generally, lose their jobs, end up homeless, right? So that COVID isn't a death sentence for other reasons aside from the fact that you get sick. Now, to just set the baseline, 2 to 3 million tests daily. We are currently at about 120 to 150,000 daily. And again, we need 3 million daily. We've done about 4 million total. Now, why is that the case? Well, there are a couple of reasons the United States is so bad at this. One of them, yes, is the federal government. Oh, Tila says that's like 0.01% of the population a day. I don't know if you say that to make it sound like it's manageable or it's a lot, because the United States is a big country. We got 350 million people, but it sounds very manageable to me when you put it that way. So I'm going to assume you mean manageable, but correct me if I'm wrong. Certainly other countries have been much better at per capita testing. Currently 0.009%. So we're close. We're close. I mean, when you're talking about low numbers in a country of hundreds of millions, small differences, big numbers make for small differences. That being said, the first big problem here is that there is no national system for doing the testing, and there's lots and lots of different private manufacturers producing something like 40 different tests. Not all of them are compatible, so you might have the test for one and the machine for analyzing the test for another, and they don't work together. So there are lots of logistical problems. There are logistical problems insofar as just to administer the test, you need swabs. And then once you have the swabs, you need the reagents, which extract the RNA and do the PCR testing. Once you do that, you need PPE for all of the folks dealing with the test and the testing. So there are lots of logistical hurdles. We already know about the lack of PPE, but that feeds into our difficulty in testing because people need PPE to be in contact with people with COVID so it doesn't spread. And then insofar as particular test logistics, we have an issue where the reagents are largely manufactured in China, and they're quite difficult to get our hands on. When you do manage to find some, the federal government oftentimes is scooping them up and directing them to other places. This is how Andrew Cuomo describes it, at least, and as does the governor of Colorado. So it's quite a difficult situation. A lot of it has to do, again, with failure of local governments, state governments, and the federal government, most of all, to coordinate and figure this out. But also there's a legitimate lack of supply of a lot of critical material. Although, again, a lot of it has to do with the lack of government to A, prepare, or B, coordinate, or use the Defense Production Act to ramp up production of necessary equipment. But whatever. If you manage to get tested, though, then we can move on to the tracing part. And, contact tracing is exactly as it sounds. I don't want people to think that it's like super duper difficult or what have you. Oh, correction from Tila, who I guess is crunching the numbers in the background. We need to test 0.01% of the country daily, pretty much. And we're currently testing 0.00095%. So in a big country, big numbers make small differences, but we are really far away from success. And again, just to give you the raw numbers, 2 to 3 million a day versus what we're doing now, which is like 120 to 150,000 a day. So yeah, it's pretty bad. And Tila says, depending on the type of test kit, they would be super easy to use and could, in theory, be done at home by a normal person. Yes, I've read about these at-home test kits. Right now, we don't have them. We don't have any real testing infrastructure. But ideally, you have at-home testing, and Israel, which I think is doing a great job, has kiosks on the street where you can just stop by and get tested by a professional. Right now, though, if you want to test, there's sort of two ways that it goes down. If you aren't presenting life-threatening symptoms and you show up at a hospital or one of the test locations, you get a one-time nasopharyngeal swab, which goes up your nose, way deep into the back, and then comes out. And they run a PCR test on it, which extracts and amplifies, basically replicates over and over again, the RNA found in the swab to see if there's COVID-19, which they test against a null version to see if there's a significant amount. And then, boom, that's how they do it. And it's this one-time thing. If you show up and you are on death's door or you're experiencing bad symptoms, then you'll get the swab, which takes time to process, although there are lots of talks about 5-minute tests and one-day tests. Some of these have absolutely hit the market. The 24-hour test is out there. The 5-minute test, I'm not sure if that's really being mass-produced yet. But then you get the swab and you go, and they do a CT on your chest and an X-ray on your chest, and then they do other regular blood work and urine work, and then make a determination as to whether or not you should be admitted to the hospital. And that's before they might have the results from the COVID-19 test itself. Tila says, I wish we had those testing kiosks, and yeah, that would be pretty useful, but somebody's got to pay for them and manage them. And I don't know who would do that, because the United States is all about private sector ingenuity and not so much with coordinated government action. Super annoying. Yes, well, Tila says that the nasopharyngeal swab is really not that dramatic, and I did dramatize it. And, all I want to say is they're not that pleasant. You're basically sticking a Q-tip way up your nose. But you can practice at home if you want. It's not going to kill you, that's for sure. Well, I don't know that for a fact, but I don't think anybody's ever died from it. Okay, so anyway, once you get the testing done, it's time for the contact tracing. And there's basically 3 ways that this goes down. And we're not really doing any of them great. And as you might imagine, the first line of defense is, of course, the federal government. So the CDC and a couple of other agencies and organizations keep track of all of the positive COVID tests all around the country. That way they know where the coronavirus is. that is the very first level of contact tracing to know where the virus at least is at any given moment and who has it. This is burdened by the fact that there is not great coordination between the states and the hospitals and the federal government, but it's being done. Once you get to the next level, once you know who's got the virus, and again, this can be done within the states or within a single hospital or within municipalities, but you really want it done at a national level so that you're catching everybody, because people can move in and out of municipalities, people can move in and out of states. But after you've gotten past that first level of testing people and knowing who has it and keeping track of those folks, you then go back to the folks with whom they have close contact. These would be relatives and close friends, significant others. And this is actually something that's been done before to great effect. It was used during the AIDS epidemic and was very effective to trace back all of the people who might have been exposed to the virus. Once you have a network of people who might have been exposed by this individual, you quarantine all of them. And again, the whole goal here is to quarantine only the people who you know have the virus and only quarantine the people who are likely to have been exposed to it, allowing everybody else to go about their daily lives. The next level of this, which is something that is new to the modern day, is all of the technological work that's done. We mentioned yesterday, Connecticut is going to have drones that determines the distance between people in public spaces, determine whether they are social distancing. There'll be potentially infrared, which determines whether or not people have fevers. You can pull people out of a crowd this way, and also pull the people around them who were within 6 feet or what have you, out of that crowd as well. There's also a couple of other really, really disturbing things that they're doing, although if anonymized, if done properly, not a problem. But very often do I have faith in either the government or these massive tech companies. But Apple and Google, for example, said that they would be accessing the geolocation from people's smartphones to help contact trace backwards from known infections. So if you have a known infection, they can use your GPS data to tell where you've been, and then use the massive database of everybody else's cell phones to say who was in proximity to you at any given time, and thereby work backwards to contact that you might have had with folks who you don't know. Now, this is potentially a gigantic privacy problem waiting to happen. It's massive surveillance, but again, if totally anonymous, until you find individuals who are sick, doesn't have to be a problem. However, I will say, and change your Facebook passwords after you hear this, Facebook just had a humongous breach of personal information. Something like 200 million people's information was lost or made available to hackers. So practice safe cyber hygiene. Change your password every 6 months. Don't use the same password for everything. And try to use whole phrases or passwords that are long but are not predictable, so that you can have strong cybersecurity. That being said, this is why I worry about these massive troves of all of my geospatial information being available to the government and Facebook and Google and Apple. But whatever, a topic for another time. I have introduced many resolutions to the State Democratic Party about these topics and other technology issues that people don't seem to know or really appreciate. But the panopticon is coming, and I believe in government as a force for good as much as any other good progressive, but I'm also huge on civil liberties. I think they're very, very important. Now, the last part of this, so to sort of build on that, the other thing that they can use in the same vein are also your status updates, because those can be time tagged and geotagged. And of course, metadata. And metadata is the whole big thing that PRISM was about. and it's what the NSA was using to find terrorists. They don't need to know your specific phone number or the contents. Well, they need to know your phone number, like if they're doing phone tracing, but they don't need to know the contents of your communication per se. They just need to know other data about it, like when it was sent, from where it was sent, to whom it was sent, to whom you were in proximity. And so they can do a lot without actually reading your specific communications or going into the actual data on your phone. But it is some danger. Yeah, whatever. The digital contact tracing is extremely powerful and comes with its own set of risks. But that being said, we want to stop coronavirus. But to some extent, we want to preserve our civil liberties. Again, to go back to what we were saying at the very beginning, it looks like we're doing a pretty good job. So let's just not go overboard in exchanging freedom for security here, because we're leveling, we're flattening the curve, and as long as people stay rational, we're probably going to be all right. Which is why the South is such a problem. Tila, I have like 100 passwords. TT_TT. Maybe I'm not young enough. I'm going to have to change them all now. Not all of them, just your Facebook password, unless they're all like similar. I have an algorithm that I run on a particular piece of information, which is unique to each website, which gives me a unique password that I never have to remember, because I only remember the algorithm that I run on the unique piece of information. And if I ever forget my password, I just go back to that unique piece of information, run the algorithm. But it is a pain in the butt when I have to change my password, because then I have to alter the algorithm slightly, and it's just a nuisance. It's a nuisance. Okay, now there were just a few more things that folks wanted to hear about today. Okay. Shayna, and I don't know if she's on, but hopefully she'll watch this, because I'm going to talk about it, and it's a personally impactful issue. Shayna asked about life insurance, and just sort of generally, are there milestones when you should consider getting life insurance? And when do you know whether or not you should have life insurance, basically? And the answer that I would say, look, I'm not a life insurance salesman. I'm not, those folks on TV trying to push life insurance on you or make you buy an annuity. But here's what I really have to say about life insurance. Life insurance, it's all about for whom the life insurance is. A life insurance isn't for you. You'll be dead when the money comes in. Life insurance is for other people. And the reason, the need for life insurance revolves around really two things: debts that you leave for other people, and the costs of dealing with the fact that you've passed away. So it can be very, very helpful and useful, and in a lot of cases even necessary, particularly if you come from a tradition or a culture that cares to have what would be an expensive sort of funeral, a burial, paying for a plot. A lot of people run into a lot of trouble because there's a lot of costs. A lot of people have older folks have a lot of medical issues, and they spend a lot of money on medical treatment, where people they have a long deterioration of health before passing away, and it leaves a lot of financial burden at the end. Others pass suddenly. So my mother, for example, passed away in a very sudden manner, and she happened to have life insurance. And what that really amounted to at the end was, I was just out of college. My brother was still in college, and she had a whole house and stuff in it, like an apartment with stuff in it. And I was living there at the time. And because of life insurance, I didn't have to leave. I didn't have to leave that apartment and liquidate all of her stuff. It provided flexibility and time. she wanted a cremation, so it was a pretty cheap funeral in that regard. Didn't have to do a plot or get a coffin or anything. But the question as to whether or not to get life insurance or when you should get life insurance is really about when you feel that you have obligations that will outlast your life. And the amount of life insurance that you're going to want to take out is proportional to what you're concerned the burden you might leave for others will be, and how much you want to absolve them of that. Your debts don't evaporate when you die. You can't just run up a multi-million-dollar debt, die, and have it go away. It will find somebody else to pay it. Now, if you have absolutely no relatives, you have no next of kin, it can just, they'll write it off. But for the most part, debt finds its way to somebody, and they will try to extract it. And the same goes for, and that's monetary debt, and that's other things. So that is what life insurance is for, and it's really personal and individual to any given person, and there is a value to doing it, to getting it earlier in life, because things happen suddenly, and it's a lot cheaper if you start earlier, because like health insurance, life insurance is a market solution to an information asymmetry, which is to say that nobody knows whether or not you're going to become sick, and nobody knows whether or not you're going to pass away. So you hedge. You pay a little bit now, so that in the event something happens, there's a payoff, a windfall. If you, and so the more likely you are to pass away, the less healthy you are, or the more risky behaviors you take, like depending on your job, you'll pay more for health insurance. And that is why if you have a low risk job, obviously, you're not out there battling COVID on the front lines, and it sucks for them that this is how it works. But, if you have a safe job and you live a healthy lifestyle and you don't smoke and all these other things, you'll have a better insurance rate, a better insurance premium, and you can lock that in for X number of years while you're young. And then as you age, your premiums stay low. But again, it's really about what you think the liabilities that you're incurring now will be, and who you're worried about them passing to. So let's check in on there was some comments. And Julianne says, are you saying Southerners aren't rational, lol? Oh, this is going back to my previous comment about everybody just, if we all stay inside, we'll all be fine. Growing up here was so hard. You can't explain basic concepts. It's all ideology pushed by religion and republicanism, which is an ideology. I'm glad I left, but unfortunately I'm temporarily back. People don't even want to think. It's all about how they feel and Jesus. Whatever you say, it goes back to, well, I don't know a lot about that, but I'm a Christian and I know what the Bible says. I'm thinking, do you really? Epithet. I know you're wearing clothing that mixes fabrics. I see. The Bible does have a rule against mixing fabrics, and I don't know why that's the case. But also, you're not supposed to cut trim your beard, eat shellfish, or have pork. So, there's a lot of stuff. Do people really follow the Bible? I don't know. They certainly don't seem to care much for their neighbor. It's rough. And there are a lot of things we need to be doing with our education system and how we, deal with religion in this country. We spoke about secularism the other day, and the United States is particularly unique perspective on secularism. But it is rough, and I'm sorry to hear that you're having a tough time down there. And it definitely makes me sad that it's so difficult for people to communicate with each other in the modern day. All this technology, and yet there are so many wedges. Personally, I think there's a way to do it. I definitely think there are ways to break across the barrier. If you've ever heard of deep canvassing is a political tactic of really going, when it's not an election, to talk to people about what matters to them and engaging them in a way that exposes them to an idea when there's not a consequence to answering truthfully and having a dialogue. And I've been a big proponent of deep canvassing for a long, long time, but it is extremely resource intensive. And unfortunately, that means that not a lot of people do it. There were several pushes to get it done after Donald Trump was elected, because for a fleeting moment, Democrats believed, like the Democratic Party and people with institutional resources believed that we had to build a bridge to voters that we had lost in the Midwest. A lot of that has now been replaced with, screw them, we should simply focus on our base turnout and expanding our advantages in demographics where we had an inherent advantage. But personally, I think that's super dangerous, because even if you can win every election and you can shut out folks from political power, it's not a good way to run a cohesive country. And eventually it's going to come back and bite you. And actually, we saw it come back and bite us in 2017, where a minority of the population, because of our electoral system, asserted its dominance through the Electoral College and through the United States Senate. Because we have the system we do, that sort of outreach is additionally critical. But I think ultimately we want a cohesive polity that at least aligns on certain things. Otherwise, you will have this sort of fractured country that can't get along with itself. And like, we just don't want to be there. That's not an ideal. You could hold political power that way. You know, Democrats or liberals might be able to get whatever they wanted if we somehow accomplish this, but that wouldn't make it a good win. It would just make it a political win. And I think there's a difference. And sure, we want both. And certainly in the short term, the political win is critical. But the whole point of getting that political win is so that in the long term, we can have a country which is unified and agrees again on the principles of democracy and liberty, and hold some progressive ideas about the relationship between the individual and what the government can and should do to help people when they're in tough times, as we live in the richest country on the planet. Although eventually China will overtake us and we'll only be the second richest country on the planet. And then I guess we can have a conversation about, really, should the government be doing so much to help everybody? We're not the richest. Anywho, one last thing to talk about, and that is postal banking. Although if Leonard's not here right now, I can't see. Who is this? I think I'll save it for tomorrow, because I could go on and on about postal banking, and it's pretty important. And like, basically it's the idea that the post office would be saved if we just let it do something it used to do, which is postal banking. You know what? I'll talk about it tonight, and maybe I'll talk about it tomorrow as well. And if there's any questions, then I can answer them. But basically it works like this. In 1911, the post office was given the capacity to perform banking functions. This was taken away from it in 1966. Now, throughout that period between 1911 and 1966, the post office made bank by acting as a bank. And in fact, it wasn't even that difficult, and it didn't do that much. It would take deposits from people, and it would transfer that money to one of several established other banking institutions in the area for interest. The post office would take a 0.5% cut, which helped keep the post office profitable, and then the banking institution would handle the rest. It was just a transfer agent. However, this is not a meaningless or unimportant role. There are lots of communities in our country that do not have access to bank branches or to easy banking. The reason for this is banks write them off as unprofitable. What this results in is an entire section of the population which is, quote, unbanked. Unbanked people do not have a place to A, put their money, or B, invest in things. They don't earn interest, and they don't have a capacity to engage in taking out loans for small businesses. They have nowhere to go and do that, which leaves their community in a financial desert, right? If you live in a good community, you have banks, which allows people to deposit their money, which then gets lent back out to the community, which drives economic activity. In unbanked areas, you don't have this. Instead, what you tend to have are predatory lenders, because people still need money, like payday loans and loan sharks. Loan sharks are uncertified people who make loans like the mob used to do, or maybe still does, like watch The Godfather, and payday lenders. And these folks charge, or tend to charge, usurious rates. That is to say, ridiculous amounts of money for the service that they're offering, which if you just had access to a regular bank, you would never go to them. So payday lending, for example, is a gigantic problem in the United States, where people who need a cash advance or a little bit of money, they go to the payday lender, they get an advance on their paycheck. The payday lender charges them maybe 20% of the money they make, and then they pay that money back with their paycheck. But they've lost 20% of their money. But people have emergencies. They have emergencies like health emergencies. Somebody breaks a bone, somebody gets sick. They crash their car, or somebody crashes into them. Somebody robs their house. Any number of things. But once you lose 20% of your paycheck, you end up requiring more money to make up that gap of 20%. Because remember, these folks are the ones who are struggling to make ends meet. And as they struggle to make ends meet and hand over money that they've earned to payday lenders, they require more and more loans, creating a cycle of debt, which leads to a cycle of poverty. Actually, getting back to life insurance, then they rack up bills that when they die get passed on to their children. So then there'll be a lien against the house or something like this. And then the vultures come in and extract what they can. And they don't have any insurance. And so there is no cushion. It's a humongous problem. How could we solve it? Well, one very simple solution would be to introduce postal banking. And this would also solve another gigantic problem, which is that the post office is about to go bankrupt sometime in September or October. And then we will lose postal service, banking aside, to remote areas of the country, and vote by mail will be a pipe dream, because how can you vote by mail without mail? Now, what does postal banking entail? One, the post office would take deposits. People could store their money there for a low but not zero interest rate, but at least it would be safe and would be insured by the federal government. So they wouldn't have to worry about losing their money by putting it in a bank, or, holding it in their house or keeping it on their person. Two, short-term loans. The post office already does, money orders, and already cashes treasury checks. It is a very, very, very short leap for them to cash payday checks. And again, payday lenders don't just do payday lending, they'll also cash your payday check for a ridiculous fee. But people need cash and they have nowhere else to go. There's no bank. You think of it as like, oh, well, I have a check and I go to my bank and I cash it and I get money and it doesn't cost me anything. But when you don't have a bank around, you have to go to one of these payday lenders and they'll take your check and they'll say, I'll give you the cash for it, but I'm going to take a 20% fee. That's insane. That's absolutely insane. 20%, 15% of your income gone every month because you don't have access to a bank. Everybody has access to a post office, because that's the mandate of the post office. They have post offices everywhere. They're almost universally accessible, which is what makes the post office great for mail. And therefore, if they just did the check cashing or did payday loan advances, people would have the capacity to keep their money, build wealth, and get loans that they need to open businesses, or pay for emergency situations. It's not that these loans would be free, but they wouldn't be usurious. They wouldn't be rates that are completely, again, unfair for the rates that you would normally pay if you just had a little bit more privilege, a little bit more access to a regular financial institution. So that's what postal banking is. It's an incredibly productive and valuable service. And it would save the post office, or it could, I should say, save the post office. But I do want to say, just reiterate for the sake of argument, that the post office is going bankrupt not because it doesn't run a profitable business. It's going bankrupt because politicians passed a bill which requires it to fund pensions in a way that's not required of any other institution in our society. And so the handicapping of the post office is one that's done by Congress. And whether or not we have postal banking, I say that it could save the post office because it could make up the deficit that the post office is running right now because of coronavirus. But we could also just not handicap the post office or hinder the post office by making it meet in advance 100% of its pension obligations. Won't go into how that works because we've done it before. Or even if we instituted postal banking, Congress would find another way to ruin the finances of the post office. So that's why it's only a could solve the problem. That being said, we've got one more comment from Julianne, and then I'm going to go eat some beans, I think. We as Dems, this is a Seymour. We as Dems need to do more deep canvassing. Ah, yes. It's so hard. It takes so much time. It takes a lot of love and compassion for those who hate you because, believe me, they do. It doesn't take love or compassion. I was mocked for my views by family and others. I think the way we need to go about it is reigniting the social gospel. I like the work of Reverend Barber and his Unite the Poor, or it's the, not the Unite the Poor campaign, it's the Poor People's Campaign. To talk to Southerners, you need to approach them on their terms. Difficult, believe me, I know, but he does it in a good way. Religion wasn't always the purview of the Republicans. MLK is an example. Dorothy Day is another wonderful example. Yes. When I got involved in the Young Democrats of America, there were two folks who were starting a religion or faith caucus, and they were doing a lot of work to try and bring Young Democrats messaging into the faith community and to bring faith language into the Young Democrats. And they were honestly doing some amazing work. It was really great stuff. I was a big supporter when I went to some of their conferences and summits, but unfortunately it just didn't fly. People just, it just didn't really catch on in a way that it needed to. I feel the same way about speaking Spanish or speaking to Latino issues beyond immigration, because ultimately a lot of Latinos come from, they're very Catholic and they come from countries where they are socially conservative. They have a different view generally in terms of the sort of fiscal and social services angle, because they subscribe more to an Catholic charity sort of model. But, we take the Latin and Hispanic vote for granted entirely in the Democratic Party because we assume immigration is the only thing they care about and that they're like this monolith and, we're just going to paint the Republicans as racist. As it turns out, the Republicans have done a great job demonstrating that they're racist. So now we're on more solid footing in that regard. But I still think it always behooves political parties and those who want to build political power and democracy to legitimately, earnestly, and authentically speak to the issues of those they would seek to represent. And there you have it. Anywho, thanks everybody for tuning in today, and we'll be at it tomorrow at 8:30. See you later. And James, I see you. Thanks for tuning in, man. We'll not get together soon, but let's chat soon.